let's have a chat today about complex trauma. When we think about trauma, there are so many different levels and so many different variables. I was a person who, I laughed with my friend Tina, until I met her, I didn't have trauma, which the reality was, until I met her, I didn't recognize that the impacts of what had happened in my life and the events that had happened, the incidents that happened, and all the things that had happened, I never labeled them or ever recognized them as anything resembling trauma. I didn't recognize that they would have an impact in my life. I didn't recognize anything to do with how my current relationships were showing up and how my current interactions with others could have or would have been impacted by what was actually a trauma. So simple stuff that I just wrote off as it's just normal life. I was picked up at the age of 4. My parents immigrated to another country. We left all our family and all our friends and everybody that we knew that was known, and were brought to another country. Yeah, beautiful life my parents gave me, but I didn't recognize there would have been a level of trauma for that little 3-year-old girl to be picked up out of that environment and taken somewhere else, completely different. Then there was, by the time I got to 18, my mum had got sick very, very quickly. 2 weeks later, boom, she's gone. I didn't recognize that as any sort of trauma. My children were born. They had to be resuscitated, blood transfusions, all the other horrible stuff about childbirth. Didn't recognize it as any trauma. Then came through my divorces. So much of what we have in trauma in our normal lives is just normal. We label it as it's just normal. There's no recognition that it had an impact, or that it could have had an impact, or how I'm behaving today or how I'm showing up is as a result of that impact of that thing that happened. So what we want to do with our clients is give them that ability to be able to move through these traumas. So while something like being picked up at the age of 4 and moved to another country may not have a significant impact in my life, however, my divorces certainly does have an impact in my life, because it's the way I show up in new relationships. I have triggers to resolve. I have hurts to overcome. Lots of things that need to be resolved for myself, for my choices to move forward. So when we think about our clients, they're going to have different traumas that happen, and they're going to label them differently. For so many of us, it's just normal, whatever happens. There's nothing out of the ordinary that happens. It's just life. So when we think of those sorts of traumas for our clients versus something that, say, happened as an adult, say there's been a car accident, say there has been, some sort of attack, say there has been something significant in their life that's happened as an adult, that's also going to be quite different for your clients as well. They're going to show up differently. They are going to behave differently. I have seen people who have had car accidents who then the way they go outside, the way they drive their car, and maybe they never drive their car again, all those things are so much different. So there is then a domino effect for that, because, well, I've had this accident, I'm not comfortable driving, so therefore I don't drive, therefore my partner has to drive, or people have to pick me up, I become reliant on the bus, I am no longer independent, I no longer can get around. And can you see how this keeps cascading down and down and down until the person's life just becomes that little bit smaller, little by little, because all of the impacts of what has happened in this one event may have happened on a Tuesday afternoon, then has this cascading effect. When we think of that as the complex traumas, it's the multi-layered stuff that I think of, not the actual event necessarily that happens, because quite often what will happen in an event, you and I could be in the same car accident, you are going to language it and label it differently. The impacts are going to be different, because what happens for us each is it's the shock point. What was the worst part about that accident? What was the worst part for me about the accident? What was the worst part for you about the accident? They're going to be quite different. So with our clients, we want to be able to help them to differentiate what the shock points are. Then the next part is, what is the story we tell ourselves about what happened? What is the story that repeats in our mind? Is it something you see, something you hear? Is it about the event right in the moment? Is it something that happened 10 minutes later, 15 minutes later? All those little components are the bit that we want to do tapping on to help that more complex trauma that sits at the top to be released and resolved and for the body to process the emotions, for the body to process the sensations, and to be able to let it go. So that for me is one of the ways that I start to think about when I meet up with a client and they start to tell me what their event is. I don't necessarily start with a labeling of, is this complex, is it not? I just understand that we need to help them to break it down into the little components. We need to help them to remove the story that they tell. If it's a significant story and it's a repeating story and they keep going on and on about what happened, and they keep having flashbacks, maybe they keep having triggers that happen, they have things that happen in their daily life to that event, it's each one of those that we want to be able to help to pull apart for them, get into the table legs, as we call. We teach a lot about table legs versus tabletops. The car accident, as an example, would be a tabletop. We want to get into the legs. We want to get into the story. What are they telling themselves? How are they showing up? What is the body remembering? I had an incident with one of my sons a couple of years ago. He was moving overseas. I didn't think he was ready for it. There was a whole lot of emotional stuff going on for him as he left the country. But my body really remembered how heartbreaking that was and how hard that was and how it was a trauma. It was an abandonment and a separation trauma that he and I were both experiencing. But what I recognised this time when he went, as a grown adult with far more resources and capabilities, I still felt the same sensations in my body about it. The body remembers. The body keeps score. The body could remember how that felt when I thought about him leaving. My body could remember all of that. So for me, it was a really great opportunity to do some tapping on what my body was remembering. So we'll have that in our clients as well. What's the body remembering from the past thing, or something that resembled this, something that reminds them of this? We want to go into all of those. So they're the things you want to be thinking of when you're going to be doing some complex trauma. Now, how do we as practitioners, how do we actually utilize our tools and our skill set and the stuff that we know? Understanding the complexities of trauma is multi-layered. I want to throw in here also with some of the complex traumas. There is also a risk, and you need to be mindful of re-traumatizing your client or them spiraling emotionally after they leave your session. So you have to be very mindful. So as much as we all train our practitioners to be to understand trauma and to be able to help clients move through them, there is also another level of understanding that you need to have when you're working with people who have experienced significant trauma, to recognize that what you work on in the session, while it was resolved in the session, isn't a vacuum in their life. There are so many other parts to this that you need to be very mindful of, not going too fast, not going too deep, not giving your clients a space to get support after the session, because it can be, and I learned this the hard way, like many of us do, there is such a space that it needs to be slow, gentle, and at a pace that the client can cope with and is fine with. And it's just a learned skill. It's nothing fancy that I have that you don't have. If you're a new practitioner, it is just, you need to just calibrate your client as you're going, recognize where they're at, read them where they're at, and start to be able to keep them with you, keep them present, keep their eyes open. Don't let them go into story or up into story. Don't let them get into too much an emotion. Not that you don't want them to feel, but don't let them go too far in, because that gets them so dysregulated and so disengaged and so disassociated that you won't actually be able to do any work with them. All right. So if you're going to go and do some trauma work, recognize the layers. So how are we going to do tapping? Let's go back into the cool stuff about how do we use tapping. So if I'm going to work with someone who's got trauma and they are emotional at even thinking about it, we'll go back to our car accident example. We've got someone who's had a car accident, they're quite emotional even when they think about the car accident. You're going to tap with your clients on the thought of the car accident. You're not going to go into it. You're going to stay really global. You're going to stay really out of it. And you're going to do tapping with them on them thinking about the idea of talking about the car accident, not the car accident. You want to keep them out here. You want to keep them up above the actual story that they'll tell people. Use the movie technique. The movie technique is wonderful for helping to keep people kind of out of the story, particularly if they don't want to share the details with you. They maybe just imagine it. Think back to that time when that happened. And you could do some tapping there to help to release that emotional intensity, to help to release that that sort of triggering that they're going to have. You want to be able to do some tapping with them at that more global level, at the top level, before you even get into it. That's one of the first things you'll do when somebody's clearly got some significant trauma or they're quite emotional when they first come to see you. Then you're going to let them have a little bit of conversation. They're going to talk to you about what they've got going on. They're going to talk to you a little bit about what the story is and what happened. Then you'll be able to peel it apart piece by piece. And so I said, an example like a car accident, what was the worst part about that car accident? And you might go, like, Lorna, clearly the impact of the accident, but don't assume. Don't assume for that person that it's the impact. They may not have even been the driver and may not have even been watching. So in the shock of it happened, it may not be till the car stopped and then they've gone into some sort of shock about it, because you don't know what the story is they're telling themselves. So you want to find out what that story is from the complex traumas. What's the belief system they have around it? What do they make it mean about themselves? Something like a car accident, you could have, were they at fault? Did they cause it? Was there children involved? Did someone else cause it? So there's anger and resentment to the other person. There could be the later impacts that they've had some medical stuff. Don't ever assume what it might be. Actually ask them. That's the easiest way to put it. Actually ask them. So here's a recap. You're going to tabletop it. You're going to figure out that they've got some trauma that's going on and what the story is around that. You're then going to help them to find out the stories they tell themselves, what the shock point was of that, what the impact was of that. And you're going to help them with your tapping to break down each of those little legs of that table to get as many of them down to zero as you can. Quite often when you get the big ones down, the others are like a little spider's web. They all just fall apart. That's really easy to do as well. So that's what you're going to do with your clients. You're going to pull that all apart. Thank you for joining me. Much love to everyone. Remember, if you're dealing with trauma, don't go where you're not experienced. Don't go into something with someone where you don't have the expertise. It's not that you can't learn the skills and the expertise. You just don't want to do some extra damage in there by opening them up and not giving them the support that they need when some of our traumas are kind of opened up a little bit like Pandora's box, and we need to get into the weeds with them and give them extra support. So I'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing with me. And I will see you all again very, very, very soon.